Hi, my name is Allison Johnson, and I'd like to welcome you to the State Historical Society of Iowa. We greatly appreciate your support for our institution, whether you attend one of these lectures or come to our reading room to engage in research. We are continuing our Iowa Stories lecture series today, and we'd like to encourage you to view this program or some of our past lectures on the City Government TV Channel 4. Thanks to Ty Coleman and his crew for filming these events and for expanding our audience. Thank you also to Charles Scott for his technical assistance today. Paul Juhl is a remarkable Iowan and one of our best friends. He has a special interest in 19th century photography, and he has amassed the most comprehensive collection of Iowa stereographs in the world. Lucky for us, he generously donated thousands of these rare images to the State Historical Society of Iowa. He enjoys researching and writing books about notable Iowans like artist Grant Wood, author McKinley Cantor, and sculptor Vinnie Ream Hoxie. He has written about the Lincoln and Harlan grandchildren at the summertime resorts in Clear Lake. Paul earned his BA in history from the University of Iowa and a master's degree in college student personnel services from the University of Northern Iowa before working as a guidance counselor in Iowa schools. In fact, he was honored as Iowa's Guidance Counselor of the Year. Please join me in welcoming Paul today.
Well, thank you, Allison. It's always a pleasure to be here at the State Historical Society in Iowa City, where over the years, about 30 years in fact, I've done a lot of research. And I want to pay a special thank you to the many librarians that have helped me over the years. It's just such an important profession, and any of us that do research understand how much they can help us. It's many times we can find things online, but it's that librarian that can point us in a certain direction and help us find the information that we need. Now, a disclaimer to begin with, so that everybody's aware of that. I'm not an architectural historian, and I'm also not a biographer. But I did find the life of Frank Lloyd Wright to be very compelling and also very fascinating. As an Iowan, as most of you know, I really like to research the connections between our state and people like Frank Lloyd Wright or Grant Wood or some of the others. And today's presentation will show you these connections, and I'll also give you some biographical information on Frank Lloyd Wright. I know you're going to enjoy it. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright was actually born Frank Lincoln Wright, and he was born right after the Civil War, June 8, 1867, in the small farming town of Richland Center, Wisconsin. He lived a very long life, 91 years, and passed away in April of 1959. Now, he was an American architect who designed over 1,000 structures, 532 of which were completed. And he believed in designing structures that were in harmony with humanity and with the environment. It was a philosophy that he called organic architecture. He was also a pioneer, however, in the concept that, or movement, I guess I would say, called the Prairie School. And finally, he also developed the concept of the Usonian homes. Many have called him, and I guess I would call him this too, as the greatest American architect of all time. His father was named William Carey Wright. He was really quite a Renaissance man. He had a good, strong Eastern education, New England, in oration. He was schooled in music and law, and also the Baptist ministry. His mother, Frank's mother, Anna Lloyd Jones, had been born in Wales and was a country school teacher with little formal education when they first met. Anna was from a strong and large Welsh family that farmed in a valley near Spring Green, Wisconsin. They were also strong members of the Unitarian Church. In fact, one of Anna's brothers, and by the way, she went by Hannah during the first years of her life, later Anna, one of her brothers was a very important pastor in a large Unitarian church in Chicago. Wright had two wives, William Wright. His first wife was named Parmelia, and she had died leaving him a widower with 3 small children. So when Anna married William, she began her life as a stepmother. Anna's first child and William's 4th child then was Frank. And she later said that when she was expecting, she dreamed that her first child would grow up to build beautiful buildings. She told people that she had actually decorated his nursery with pictures of English cathedrals that she had torn from magazines in order to encourage the infant's ambition. And this shows the 2 families. William Wright had 6 children, 3 by Parmelia and 3 by Anna. And you can see their birth dates there too. Well, during their early years of marriage, William Wright served as a Baptist minister in several congregations within the area of southwest Wisconsin, and later he was to serve some congregations on the East Coast in New England. One of these congregations near southwest Wisconsin, they actually crossed over the Mississippi River, and they became Iowans for a period of time, about 2 years. This was one of his stops along the way. This was McGregor, Iowa, and William became pastor of the Baptist Church in March of 1869, just before the birth of Anna's 2nd child, a girl, that they named Jane. So by 1870, this family consisted of William, 44, Anna, 31, Charles, 14, George, 12, Elizabeth, 10, Frank, 3, and Jane, 1. Now, some years later, and after they had left Iowa, they would have another daughter they named Margaret Ellen, later known as Maganel. William Wright was extremely popular as a pastor, as he had been with all of his previous churches. In fact, some people in McGregor said that he gave the best sermons they had ever heard. And this is how Frank looked when they were living in McGregor. It was taken by a popular McGregor photographer of the time. It was also known that Anna, Frank's mother, showered him with attention. Well, also in McGregor at that time, it was a very busy little seaport, river port, and one of the families that the Wrights would have known was the Rungling family, later called Ringling, who lived on one of the side streets. Now, Mr. Rungling ran a harness and saddle shop, and of course the town at this time was filled with horses, so it was a very profitable occupation. They weren't Baptist, but rather they were Lutheran, but the paths of the Wrights and the Ringlings would have crossed. Later, of course, 5 of these boys, and they're pictured here at the bottom of this slide, 5 of them would go on to circus fame as the Ringling Brothers. There was also another man in town, lots of other people in town whose names we might recognize, one of whom was Diamond Joe Reynolds. He, of course, the gambling man who today Diamond Joe's in Dubuque is named after. Well, this is William Wright, William C. Wright, during those same years. In April of 1871, however, the family left McGregor, and they went back east, as I said, where William had family. These were, there were some really extreme stresses beginning for this family, even in McGregor. The wages of pastors, of course, were very low, and the size of the family, with the size of the family, there just wasn't enough money to go around. They now had, of course, the 5 children, and later they would have Maginot, so they'd have 6 children. And William was also aware of some tensions between Anna and his 3 older children, Anna's stepchildren, especially the youngest and the only girl from the first family, whose name was Elizabeth. And there is Frank at the time that he was just after they had left McGregor. They moved to Weymouth, Massachusetts. That's near Boston. And Anna had a chance to go to the Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. And there she learned about a new concept in education that they called kindergarten. The idea came from a German named Friedrich Wilhelm Froebel, and he used blocks and symbols, color, form, patterns to expose children to have sensory experiences with these. Well, Anna, being a former teacher and always showing the most attention to her son, Frank, she thought this idea would really be perfect for him. So she bought what was called the Froebel tools, and she spent hours teaching him about the Froebel method. This idea was very popular in Iowa beginning after the Civil War. This is kind of a rare shot of a kindergarten in West Branch, Iowa. Now note that some of the Froebel tools are there on the tables. It certainly doesn't look much like a kindergarten as we would think of them today. West Branch had a large Quaker population, and Quakers were very interested in education. Many of the larger Iowa towns, cities, of course, also began programs in this Froebel method. Well, the family continued to struggle financially in the East, and they returned to Madison, Wisconsin in 1877, where William taught music lessons. He especially enjoyed teaching Bach. And during these years, he made a major change in his life. He left the Baptist Church and chose to become a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church. He also made some other changes. He would no longer be a pastor, but he wanted to follow what he had loved for his entire life, and that was music. And he began to teach music in the state capital of Wisconsin. In fact, all of the music you heard playing today when you came in and sat down was William's music. We called it parlor music. It was popular at that time. And a few years ago, in 2013, a man named David Patterson pulled that together and created a CD which is available for purchase. Iowa has another connection with one of the Wright children, and that was the youngest child by Parmelia, Elizabeth Wright. It would have been William's third-born child. Now, there had always been some problems between Anna and the stepchildren, and now it grew worse. The two older boys, George and Charles, they were young men and out of the home much of the time, but Elizabeth was there. And finally, it became so painful for her that she chose to leave the home and live with some of her birth mother's relatives. She later attended the Rockford Female Seminary, and there she met a young girl from Iowa who encouraged her to come to Iowa and find work. Well, she did this, and she ended up spending the rest of her life in our Hawkeye State. Many of her descendants are still in the area around Marengo, Vinton, and Cedar Rapids. And they include my good friend, Mary Catherine Rogers from Cedar Rapids, who would be William's great-great-granddaughter. Her mother, Hope Rogers, lives in Vinton, Iowa, and she would be a granddaughter of Elizabeth. And this is Elizabeth Wright. At about the time she would have come into Iowa to live. She lived out her life here. She's buried in a cemetery out by Koski, if you know the name Koski, which is between Belle Plaine and Marengo. And here is William in his later years. The marriage between William and Anna ended in 1885. Anna did have her siblings nearby Madison, and she really wanted William out of her life. It's said he left with only his clothing and a violin, and he would see little or none of his three younger children again. William's heart was really in his music, and he was successful with this. As mentioned, he was a learned man and had studied medicine, law, the Gospels, and he could even make violins. But of course, music, the thing he loved, never brought in the income that he would have liked to have achieved. And during the final decades of his life, he lived in Iowa part of the time. both in Des Moines and Prairie, teaching young people and writing songs and articles for magazines concerning the teaching of music. And one thing that the Rogers family, Hope Rogers and her daughter Mary Catherine, have done is they've made a huge donation here to the State Historical Society of Iowa in Iowa City. And some of these pieces you'll see on the table after I give the presentation. You'll see a large portrait there of Elizabeth in her older years. You'll see a picture of her granddaughter Hope playing the piano or organ, I'm not sure. You'll see some of the sheet music that the family has donated here to the State Historical Society. A picture of a daguerreotype, Elizabeth as a child, and some of the Wright family pictures too. And some of this is beautiful. The lithography on it is beautiful, and the music is beautiful too. This is Pictured Rocks, one of his compositions. It's a piece probably inspired by the pictured rocks along the Mississippi River near McGregor, and it's dedicated to some of his young music students. As I said, the family here has made large donations, enough so that scholars now that are interested in Frank Lloyd Wright come here first to find out more about his father, actually before perhaps going into some of the other areas where he lived. And this slide shows Frank as a young man leaving Madison and headed for Chicago. He had some schooling in Madison. He maybe a little bit of college, high school, but he left for the city of Chicago in 1887, and he took a job with the firm of Joseph Silsby as a draftsman. Now, Chicago at that time, there had been, of course, that great fire, Mrs. O'Leary's cow, that story in 1871, and so it was a town that was rebuilding itself. It was a perfect time to be a draftsman or some kind of an architectural engineer in the town. Another person, the son of Abraham Lincoln, Robert Lincoln, went there and had a prosperous law practice at that same time. After working with Silsby for a period of time, Frank became hired by the Chicago firm of Adler and Sullivan. And Sullivan took Wright under his wing and gave him great design responsibilities. Frank would later refer to Sullivan as Liebermeister. A little interruption here.
Sorry, you can go
that's
ahead
okay.
and
that's German for dear master. Since Wright's contract, 5-year contract, forbade any outside work, he did this anyway and was eventually fired by Sullivan. And because of that, Wright and Sullivan did not meet or speak for about 12 years. This is Louis Sullivan. Frank really liked his style, the style of Sullivan. He was designing beautiful buildings in Chicago. If you've been to Chicago and seen the entrance to Carson, Peary, and Scott building, it's kind of breathtaking, I think, in downtown Chicago. Sullivan did some work here in Iowa, too, and let me show you some of those. The first is a small building. It was designed as a bank in Algona, Iowa, north central Iowa. It was never used as a bank, but they're proud of the building. Along the what would be the east side of this building, there's some lovely stained glass windows too. And of course, the one we maybe know the best is the Juhl box bank, designed by Sullivan. It's quite beautiful, both inside and outside. And you can see some of the ornamentation that was always prevalent in Sullivan's work. This is a clock in the interior of the bank in Grinnell. And here's a bank of the windows in that same building. And we have something much closer to home that I've been in and out of many times. And this is the Popoli Restaurant, which is the old People's Bank in Cedar Rapids. Now, if you've not been there, it's a lovely inside. I'll show you a picture of it. And you can see the mural, and it's called the Sullivan Bar in the Popoli restaurant, and that's the bar area. Heavily damaged in the flood in Cedar Rapids, but it's been brought back to life. Also in Cedar Rapids, and not far from us, is St. Paul's Methodist Church. And actually Sullivan withdrew some of his support for this project, but the following architect incorporated most of Sullivan's initial pattern. And finally, here is the Van Allen building in Clinton, Iowa. It was the main department store for many years in Clinton, Iowa. It remained that way for decades. Now it's been turned into low-income apartments. But you can see the close detail on the windows and how beautiful that is. The ornamentation is most certainly that of Sullivan. It's very recognizable. Well, after leaving Sullivan's firm, Wright established his own practice. And these young architects, he was one of them, they were all inspired by the arts and crafts movement and the philosophies of Louis Sullivan, and they kind of formed what we know as the Prairie School. And at about this same time, on June 1st, 1889, Frank married a young woman named Catherine Tobin, who was known by Kitty most of the time, and she was only 18 years old when they married. They purchased a home in a Chicago suburb called Oak Park, and children came quickly, and soon they had 6. By 1901, Frank had completed about 50 projects, including many of the homes in Oak Park, but he was constantly short on funds. He admitted often that his poor finances were perhaps partially due to his expensive tastes in wardrobes and also in vehicles and the extra luxuries that he had designed into his home. Prairie-style houses often have a combination of features. They mainly 1 or 2 stories with a 1-story projection, usually an open floor plan, low-pitched roofs with broad overhanging eaves, and a wide use of natural materials, especially stone and wood. And these are the 6 children to the right here. And you can also see the year. That was in 1909. The earlier photo was taken in 1890, and that is Kitty holding one of their children right in the center. I think I've got right there. And this is Frank right there. This is his mother, Anna, seated between them. Well, the city in Iowa that has the most connections with architects and also Frank Lloyd Wright is probably Mason City, Iowa, north central near the Minnesota border. It has lots of things to see and to do there, and certainly nationally known architects of this Prairie period contributed many of the homes. And some of these connections actually came through the Unitarian Church. One of the homes there that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright is a Stockman House. And this was built in 1908 for Dr. George and Eleanor Stockman. Now, they had heard of Wright, possibly through a design in the April 1907 Ladies' Home Journal. But when Wright came to Mason City to discuss other building plans, they contacted him to design their home. It has now been moved from its original location. Of course, they needed a parking lot, so they moved it, unfortunately. But it's now a museum, and it can be viewed. It's in an area of Mason City that they call the Rock Crest, Rock Glen neighborhood. What brought Wright to Mason City, however, was to construct a large building that was called the City National Bank and Park Inn Hotel Project. 2 lawyers in Mason City had the idea of a building complex at an important city intersection, and it was finished in 1910. And you can see a rather dramatic picture of it at night. You can see what some of the rooms, it's all been restored. However, Wright was not very parental, and he relied on his wife, Kitty, to care for his 6 children. Frank was also known to have interest in women, strong interest in women, and he was often seen with them in Oak Park in the Chicago area. In 1903, he had designed a home for a neighbor, Edwin Cheney, and he immediately took a liking to Cheney's wife, Mamah. Her maiden name had been Borthwick. She was Mamah Borthwick Cheney. She was an early feminist, and Wright seemed to view her as his intellectual equal. The two fell in love, and they were really kind of the talk of the town for a while. They could often be seen in Wright's automobile going through Oak Park. So right in the middle of his work in Mason City, Wright abruptly left for Europe to meet up with Mamah in 1909. They both left their spouses and children. Of course, Frank had 6 and Mamah had 2 young children behind. So other architects came in following Wright's plan, design, and they finished the hotel and the bank complex. Now that whole complex was saved in 2005 by a nonprofit organization called Right on the Park. They raised over $20 million to restore it all. The original bank had been foreclosed on in 1926, and the hotel portion ceased to operate as a hotel in 1972, and the property was really run down at that point. But today it is again a hotel, and the old bank has been made into an event center. There are 27 rooms in the boutique hotel, and the event center is available for wedding receptions and business meetings. Now there is another area of Mason City that's called the Rock Glen, Rock Crest area. Now some of the leaders in Mason City back in 1910, at the time in which Frank Lloyd Wright was designing the hotel, they thought that perhaps Wright could design a home for them. They found this area. It's got a little creek called Willow Creek that runs through it, and it's kind of a park-like area. But with Frank gone, the businessman turned to other architects who had been draftsmen that were working with Wright. And these names were well-known names: Walter Burley Griffin, William Drummond, Francis Barry Byrne, and others. In fact, Griffin, one of them, was later to design the city of Canberra, Australia, the chosen capital of Australia. And like Wright, many of them wore the ties and flowing garment smocks that were suitable to the realm. They liked to dress like their mentor. I'm going to show you some of those homes in Mason City. These all came from a photographer in that area named Aaron Thomas. And the first one is the Melson home, and that was designed by Walter Burley Griffin. Spectacular, isn't it? Beautiful home. This is a Frank home, designed by Barry Byrne. The Yellen home, William Drummond, architect. The Page home, Walter Burley Griffin. The Ruhl home, also by Griffin, the period 1912-1913. And this is the James Blythe house, also a Griffin design. Now, in these same years, another Prairie-style home in Iowa chose the designs of Frank Lloyd Wright. It wasn't until 1915, but there was a family named Meyer who had purchased plans for what Wright had called, this is before he had left for Europe, he called it an American system-built home. And he did the plans for it, and this home still appears in Monona, Iowa, which is up by Decorah. Well, Wright and Mema remained in Europe for over a year. Frank, during that time, was mainly working in Germany, and Mema was mainly translating for a Swedish feminist, translating from Swedish into English. And during this time, Edwin Cheney gave Mema a divorce, but Kitty refused to do so. She kept believing that Frank would probably return to her. Well, Frank returned to the United States, as did Mamie, in October of 1910, and at that time he purchased some land from his mother in the valley where all of the Lloyd Wrights were living. He bought the land April 10th, 1911, and he began to build a new home for himself there, and he called that Taliesin. He felt that, he didn't tell people this, but he felt probably that he and Mema would be secure here away from prying eyes, because a lot of people were highly critical of what they had done. This is Mema. There are only a few photos of her. A couple of years after Taliesin was finished, Frank was working in Chicago, and they had hired for the summer a man named Julian Carlton. He was a male servant, kind of a butler for the house, and his wife was a cook. And he told people he was originally from Barbados. But at that time, at the end of summer, on August 15th, he set fire to Taliesin, and he murdered 7 people with an axe as the fire burned. Mema and Frank had lived happily there for years amidst the scandal, and there were workmen still working on the house, and some draftsmen were also there. As I said, Frank was away working on a large project, and Mema's 2 children, one was 10 and one was 6, just happened to be there for a visit at this time period. Well, they were having lunch, as the story goes, and Carlton had served them lunch, and then he brought out the axe and he killed all 3 of them over the lunch table. And then he went to another part of the building where he killed some of the workers. He actually poured gasoline under the door, set it afire, and waited for them to run out to murder them too. Most of Taliesin burned down at that time. The murderer then put himself in the big stove that heated the house, and he took along with him acid. And when he knew that he was going to be caught, he swallowed that acid, and he died a few weeks later from starvation because it had so scarred his throat. So the dead included Mema. It included her 2 children, John and Martha. It included a gardener and a draftsman, a workman, and then also one of the workman's son's a teenager. And there were 2 people that survived the massacre. There's a book called Death in a Prairie House, which is very good. And a very poignant part of that is when a young girl, friend of Martha's, is coming to spend the day playing with her on her horse, and she's coming across the valley, and suddenly this little girl sees the smoke coming up from Taliesin, and she stops, and she knows there's a big problem, and then heads back home. Well, Mema had been born, she was an Iowan. She had been born actually in Boone, Iowa. Her father worked for the railroad, and they kind of moved across Iowa. Mema born in Boone, and her sister was born in Clinton, Iowa. And as I said, there's very few pictures. She was a graduate of the University of Michigan. That's where she met Edwin Cheney, and worked for a few years before they were married. And there you can see some of the destruction of the ruined Taliesin. And Mema was buried, I think the following day, by the Unity Chapel, which is right down in the valley. A simple stone marks her grave, and her remains are there to this day. Well, Kitty finally did give Frank a divorce, and so that he could marry. He married in 1922 then a woman named Maud Miriam Noel. Unfortunately, Frank was not aware of the fact that Marion had a morphine addiction, and troubles developed immediately after they had gotten married. They later divorced. But while he was still married to Marion, he met a woman named Olga Hinsenberg in Chicago, and they moved in together at the rebuilt Taliesin in 1925. And soon, Olga was pregnant with their daughter, who was born on December 2nd, 1925. So Frank Lloyd Wright had 7 children, 6 by Kitty and 1 by Olga. In 1932, Wright and his wife Olga Vanna put out a call for students to come to Taliesin to study and to work under Frank Lloyd Wright while they learned architecture and also spiritual development. And the fellowship has evolved into what we now call the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture. It's an accredited school. People have said that Frank Lloyd Wright was difficult to work with. But later another school was also established in Arizona, Scottsdale in Arizona. Well, one of his, after he came back from Europe, he conceived a new type of dwelling that he would call the Usonian house. And it's kind of a blending, he thought, of US and usefulness. And it was designed on a gridded concrete slab that integrated the house's radiant heating system. And it was kind of some new approaches to construction. Many of these featured flat roofs, and they were usually constructed without basements or attics, all features that Wright had been promoting since the early 20th century. Now in Iowa, we have several Wright-designed Usonian homes. We have others that did not use Wright's, but rather a discipline of Wright's designs. These were modern, compact homes, clean lines, low roof lines, and this one I'm quite impressed with. This is up in Cedar Rapids, and it's called the Grant Home. One of the daughters of the Grants wrote a book about it, growing up in a Frank Lloyd Wright home. This is a home in Oskaloosa, the Alsop home. I like this one. It's been damaged a lot by the floods along the river there, but this is in Charles City. It's the Miller home. And this is the Lambertson home, also in Oskaloosa. Oskaloosa has 2 Frank Lloyd Wright designed homes. The Sunday home in Marshalltown, Iowa. And finally, the Trier home in Johnston. Well, there's one other, and that one you might be familiar with, because this Usonian home is open to the public, the only one that is open to the public. And it's called Cedar Rock. It's along the Wapsipinicon River near Quasqueton, up in Buchanan County. It was commissioned in 1948 by Lowell and Agnes Walter. Lowell had made his fortune in Iowa with the Iowa Road Building Company, and that had a patent on a coating that they used on gravel roads to keep the dust down. They lived in Des Moines, but they built this in his boyhood community as a summer home. And you can see, if you tour this, and you can tour it in the summertime, you can see the amount of light that comes in. Certainly one of the facets of Usonian homes that people enjoyed. In August of 1950, Frank Lloyd Wright brought a whole group of people, including his wife there, and the people there on the left-hand side of the picture, that was Lord and Lady Pentland from England. They were visiting, and that's their daughter between Frank and Olga in the center. And here's some other views. Lowell joked with Frank Lloyd Wright, saying that he thought he probably got his inspiration for the roofs of the homes from the brim of his own hat, because it stuck out there. And here is Wright. Wright was quite proud of this. There's a boathouse with it too that's quite interesting. I think the only boathouse that Frank Lloyd Wright ever designed. There was a large group of people, I can't remember, 50 or 60 people that came. And in 1939, Frank came here to Iowa City to have a look at things. It was in conjunction with the summer arts program at the university. It was a July event, and it was a huge event. Grant Wood was there. He had come. American Gothic was shown along with his other completed works. And Frank spoke at 8 o'clock on the west approach to Old Capitol. He had very little nice things to say about Iowa City, unfortunately. He said, for instance, I won't say them all, but we found at the Johnson County Historical Society, we found some letters that had been written by one of the wives of a professor here in town, talking about having attended and her impressions of it. I use some of them in the book, but they're interesting to read. He called most of our houses just big boxes with holes cut out of them. And he said that, and some junk dragged in, he added, and for furniture. He called Grant Wood's painting not art. That wasn't art to him. And the Old Capitol, he said, it looked like a squat little old courthouse. So consequently, city leaders were possibly happy to see Frank leave town. Well, here is, of course, Grant Wood, a famous artist. Most of us know that his American Gothic is one of, they say, one of the three most recognizable paintings in the whole world, along with Mona Lisa and also Munch's Scream. But we have another interesting connection between Wood and Frank, between the two men. The young man in one of Frank's paintings, and this is Plaid Sweater, and that's the only major Grant Wood work that we have here at the University Art Museum. Blumberg grew into manhood, this young man, and was living in Clinton, Iowa in 1955. And he and his wife decided that they wanted Frank Lloyd Wright to design a home for them. They journeyed over to Taliesin to talk with Frank about the project, but it eventually didn't appear to fit with his family's needs, and possibly also the cost was high. I might add that not only does the museum have this beautiful painting, but they also have the plaid sweater in their collection too. It's recently been cleaned and kind of controversial, but it brings out that background. This is before the background. Some people have said, well, shouldn't we clean all of Grant Wood's major works? Well, this was probably the only one that would have been hung above a fireplace. All of the others were purchased by museums of his major works, but this one would have been above the fireplace and probably collected a lot of dust over the years. And there is the design that he had for the Blumbergs in Clinton. Clinton, of course, is a river town. It would have been a beautiful setting. I'm sorry it didn't happen. Well, this lovely young woman is named Dixie Wilson, and she was an Iowan from Mason City. You're putting this together, I'll bet, as I'm talking. And she was the older sister of Meredith Wilson, who wrote the famous Broadway show and movie The Music Man, also The Unsinkable Molly Brown. Dixie was a writer, and she wrote, among other things, a children's book that was very popular at that time called Honey Bear. She teamed then with the younger sister of Frank Lloyd Wright, Maganel, who did all of the illustration. She was an illustrator. So the two of them teamed together to put it together. Her name by that time was Maganel Wright Enright Barney. And here's a page from that book to see some of the illustration. Now, Mason City has continued to try to encourage their connection with architecture and with Frank Lloyd Wright. And you can see on the back of some of the buildings, there's a plan in Mason City to provide Wright designs for the back of the buildings. And I think this is nicely done, and the people seem to be enjoying it. Now, this person many of you know, because that's Juhl Lloyd Jones. He was a former chair of the University of Iowa English Department. And of course, many of us know Jean Lloyd Jones, his wife, who was a politician here too in the state legislature. Well, that's another family with ties from Mason City. Anna's youngest brother, Enos, his son, Ralph, moved to Mason City. And so Jix, his real name is Richard Lloyd Jones, but Jix grew up in Mason City and then, of course, came here to the University of Iowa. So it's a good connection for those of us here in Iowa City. In fact, I think one of Jean's daughters, Mary, is now living in Spring Green, so she went back to the area of the ancestors. And in Mason City, there are some statues, and here is one of those statues. This one is called, it's actually not called Frank Lloyd Wright because they didn't get approval to name it that, but it's just called an American architect, but you can tell it's Frank Lloyd Wright. And over by Rock Crest, Rock Glen, you'll see a large Bob McCoy Architectural Interpretation Center. Wonderful spot to visit, a gift shop, and they put on programs dealing with the Mason City architecture. Something else you might not have known is that one of Frank Lloyd Wright's children, his son, John Lloyd Wright, was the designer of Lincoln logs, something many Iowa boys and girls played with, certainly in the 50s, and I think they're still available now if you wanted to buy them. Another connection would be this lovely lady, and that is the actress Ann Baxter. She won an Academy Award, and we see her, I think, most Easters in the movie The Ten Commandments. She is Frank Lloyd Wright's granddaughter. She was Frank Lloyd Wright's granddaughter. She was the daughter of his daughter, Catherine. And some of us have actually licked the back of Frank Lloyd Wright because they issued this stamp in 1966. That's his famous structure, the Guggenheim, behind him. And we can go to some of our museums, our art museums. This is in Cedar Rapids, and you can see there that they have this wonderful, it's the Vosmuth collection, and they present that at various times, all designs by Frank Lloyd Wright. And likewise, the Figge, furniture designed by Frank Lloyd Wright now is very collectible too. And although there are other, certainly not as many Wright designs as we might have liked in Iowa, he did influence many buildings, and you can find some with some Prairie style concepts in small towns or big towns. Well, for instance, this one is in Eagle Point in Dubuque. It was designed by Alfred Caldwell. He was a landscaper, landscape architect in 1936. Or this building in Clinton, Iowa, it's a bank building, the Clinton, Iowa State Savings Bank, designed by Harry Harbeck in 1914. And look at this one. Yeah, the Summit Apartments in Iowa City. It's another example of Prairie style designed by Parker N. Berry in 1916. Well, as I said, Frank was married 3 times. This is a nice picture, I think, of Kitty, the mother of 6 of his children. This, of course, is Miriam, his second wife, a very brief marriage and a very nasty divorce. And his third wife, Olga. And there's a story here, too, with Olga that I'll tell you. I think I have enough time to tell you. Frank, when he died, he wanted to be buried next to Mama. He had requested to be buried next to Mama in the valley. In fact, Maginot wrote a book about it, and she called that valley where all of the Lloyd Joneses, the valley of the God Almighty Lloyd Joneses, is how she worded it. He wanted to be buried there by Mama, and he was buried there by Mama. Well, after Olga died in Arizona, they had created a little park there on the property, and their daughter, Frank and Olga's daughter, decided that she really wanted to have Frank's body brought to Arizona to be intermingled with her mother's ashes and spread in the park. So they went to Wisconsin, managed to get some permits, I don't know what, but they dug up Frank's body, had it cremated, and took it back to Arizona. So his cremains are mixed with Olga's, and they're in Arizona now rather than in Wisconsin. And I would guess that many people in Wisconsin were sad to see that happen. Then on April 4th, 1959, Frank Lloyd Wright was hospitalized. He was having abdominal pains, and he was operated on. And as I said, later Olga Vanna's dying wish had been that they be buried together. So after he had died and been buried, later cremated and sent down to Scottsdale. So the original grave site, if you visit the little cemetery by Unity Chapel, is empty. Mama, of course, is still there. This is one of the last pictures of the man that many have called America's greatest. This was taken in 1954 when Wright was about 87 years old. And the final view here, I don't know how well you can read that, but it says, a doctor can bury his mistakes, but an architect can only advise his clients to plant vines. So that gives you an idea of some of the Iowa connections. As you can see, there were really many connections between our Hawkeye State and the wonderful man, Frank Lloyd Wright. Thank you.
So he designed a bank in Mason City, right?
Yes, he did.
So is that a different bank than the one that John Dillinger robbed in Mason City?
I don't know. I don't know that answer. Yes. It seems to me that it's a different one. Yeah. This bank didn't last long. The Depression came along shortly after, and it was foreclosed on. Beautiful interior to it. And now you can see it again because, as I said, it's an event center. Thank you.
You may be aware, but there's a little movie they made after the robbery to kind of recreate it. It's a different building in town on a corner.
Maggie?
Just so that no Louis Sullivan building goes overlooked, is there not another building in Grinnell that has now been purchased by the university, and it was a residence?
Not that I'm aware
a Sullivan
of.
home? No?
I've never heard that.
Okay, it's a beautiful building, and it's...
Yeah. It might have been in the style, certainly
yeah.
the style
Although
of
the
Sullivan.
fact that Grinnell purchased it and added it to their collection, I think it was a little bit noteworthy.
Well, that would be wonderful
yeah,
news.
so I'll have to
yeah.
check that out.
Yeah, I'd like that.
Anybody else? Okay. Paul, did you run across any reference to a Des Moines home that was built by Frank Lloyd Wright? It was torn down. It's been gone a long time, but...
I didn't. Okay. Now, the Johnston home is near Des Moines.
It was right in Des Moines on Grand
but
Avenue. That's right. Yes.
in everything I've read, it didn't appear as if it was a Wright design. That's real confusing for people because many of the fine architects did mimic Frank Lloyd Wright in many ways. But in my reading, I came across nothing that said a building had been torn down. Actually, a building in Montana just within the last year, which was a retail building of some kind, one of Frank Lloyd Wright's designs was torn down. So it was a big loss. And why that happened, I'm not sure.
When was the Guggenheim built?
Right at the end of his career. I don't have an exact date on that, but that stands out as probably his greatest structure, that's for sure.
Anybody else?
Well, I thank you for coming.
Let's give
it's
Paul
always
another
fun
round
as
of
I
applause.
What I really enjoy about history is that it's just so much fun to share it with people. You know, you come across something, you just think, oh, I wish I had a whole group of people here I could share this with. So
Well,
you were that group today.
You'll discover Paul's very modest and humble about his accomplishments. So I want to hawk his book for him. He's got it available here for sale if anybody's interested, and happy to autograph them. And there are many other books in our library that I encourage you to come and look at. And I do hope you'll come up and look at some of the treasures that have been bestowed upon us by the Rogers family. It's really quite a gift. These could have gone to the Smithsonian, to Oak Park, Illinois, many other places, Arizona, and here we are lucky in Iowa to be holding these treasures. So please come up and enjoy them. If you really want to see the original daguerreotype, I'll go pull it out for you. But we just have a reproduction here. So thanks for coming today. I want to invite you to come back here on May 8th when Tim Walsh will be speaking about the Irish in Iowa. He's bringing Harold Donnelly with him, so there'll be a lot of jokes about Donnelly's Bar. We're going to follow that up by Dr. Joe Coulter is going to talk about native health issues, and then Rebecca Conard's coming in here on May 30th because a group of public historians have created a documentary about Marie Curie, and they'd like to preview it in front of an audience and get some feedback. So if you can join us on May 30th, we'd really enjoy it. Thank you very much.